the area of manned spaceflight, the budget request for Apollo is being reduced by $42.1 million to $916.5 million. This reduction will be achieved by canceling the Apollo 15 and 19 lunar missions, redesignating the remaining Apollo flights as Apollos 14 through 17.
Everything is going smoothly here at the Kennedy Space Center for the launch of Apollo 17, man's last trip to the moon in the foreseeable future.
Three, two, one, ignition. We're on our way, Houston.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
The average taxpayer is entitled to ask, what's in space for me?
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Roger, we got a roll program.
Tower cleared.
Roger, roll.
What does spaceflight do for people? It's a philosophical answer. It's exploration. It's the human spirit of going out there.
The great thing we want to know is, where do we fit in? There's two questions that trouble us all at some point in our life. Where did we come from? And are we alone?
Without the space program, our economy would be hurled 50 years back into the past. Think of it for a moment. GPS, weather satellites, telecommunications, the internet.
By the exploration of the moon, or by landing on the moon and walking around, that led to a space program, which led to global positioning systems, which led to so-called space assets, which have affected everything.
The reason to explore space is that it can boost our economy. Period. It boosts our economy because it changes the culture. People think differently. They think about the future. Think about inventing things. They think about making a better tomorrow rather than just surviving the day.
You go over the hill, you don't know what you're going to find. And you're not going to go over the hill unless you're curious about it.
It transforms the intellectual outlook of a nation when a nation embarks in something bold and audacious, such as going into deep space, as it did in the 1960s.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster, in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
In 1957, Sputnik was launched. And if you ask me what drove the creation of NASA, it was the launching of Sputnik. The public often thinks of Sputnik as, oh, it's just an innocent little satellite that went beep. Let's part the curtains, and you find out This was the shell of an intercontinental ballistic missile that had been hollowed out and a radio transmitter put in the head. That's what was flying over our heads in America on October 4th, 1957. Spooked us to no end. No one said, oh, the frontier of exploration is breached. No, it was the Soviet Union has the new high ground. They are our sworn enemy. We can't look bad in front of them. We've got to do it too. We need an agency to take care of this. A year later, NASA was founded.
This special report brought to you by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
What we had was something that had come out of a very can-do spirit. It came out of the spirit of winning World War II. It came out of the technology burst that was going on around the world at that time. It came out of the imaginations of people like Wernher von Braun and Willy Ley and Walt Disney.
In our modern world, everywhere we look, we see the influence science has upon our daily lives.
Now here's a model I designed for a 4-stage orbital rocket ship.
It came out of the inspiration of people like Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and Silverberg and all the great science fiction writers at the time who were inspiring children and all kinds of people in that realm. And then we had the spark that ignited that passion into a fire that was sort of Sputnik.
People said, what happens if there's a hydrogen bomb orbiting Head? If the Russians have the high ground, then we could be outmaneuvered in the next war.
The United States, too, promised to launch an Earth satellite. But in our satellite program, we Americans got badly bogged down. Why? What happened? We had the money, the resources, and the scientific know-how. Unfortunately, a series of wrong decisions led us to frustration and failure. This order went out to the armed services. Let me read it to you. Recent news stories which have described certain projects as space flight projects have resulted in unfavorable reaction at Department of Defense and congressional levels. In any speeches or public releases planned by you or your staff, avoid the mention or the discussion of space, space technology, and space vehicles. And so, by the summer of 1957, space had become a forbidden word in Washington.
In totally realistic terms, von Braun could have had us there in 1950. We need to understand, we would have launched a satellite in 1950. The reason we did not is because we didn't wish to.
Panic set in. And after that, people said, okay, let's regroup, let's do something. It was your patriotic duty to become a physicist, a chemist, a mathematician. It was for America and for freedom that people said, yes, I want to become a Cold Warrior for freedom and for liberty.
The history of human reaction to the threat of death knows no bounds. And knowing no bounds includes birthing an entire space program for the purpose of showing the world that we will not be bested by evil, godless communists. Such was the mood and the attitude in the 1950s.
Man had his first great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold. He was Yuri Gagarin, the astronaut the Russians lionized as the first to orbit the Earth. It was the propaganda coup of the year.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
At the time that President Kennedy made his speech, we had never been to orbit. Just a little bit over a week before the Kennedy speech to the U.S. Congress, we had launched Alan Shepard.
Liftoff. All right, liftoff, and the clock has started.
We'd never been to orbit, and we were challenged to beat the Russians to the moon. So to a great extent, that initial challenge was one that I believe was geopolitical. But it also had the economic benefit to basically generate the enthusiasm and the passion within the American public.
The spur to education, very, very important. I think that's almost as significant as our actual flights themselves, because it gave all the young people something to look forward to, an excitement, something that they could live up to. Every day, I meet people now in their 50s who said, look, when I was a little kid, you inspired me to become an engineer or become a scientist or become a doctor. And that gives me sort of a sense of satisfaction that I was in a program that helped other people form good careers. I think one of the greatest moments of the last century in the space program was the flight of Apollo 8. I was on that flight. At the time that we did it, I don't think we fully understood the significance of the very first flight to the moon, the whole 240,000 miles. We were the pathfinders. We didn't land, but we checked the navigation, checked the communication, circled the moon, and looked at the far side, the side that we never see from the Earth. We brought back with us a photograph of the Earth from the moon. We called Earthrise, which I think in just one picture told us how insignificant we all are here on Earth. The Earth is merely a small planet that just so happened to be at the right distance and in the right mass to sustain life, going around a rather normal star, and that star is in the outer edge of a galaxy called the Milky Way, just one of millions of galaxies in our universe. And maybe just for a small amount of time in December of 1968, everyone kind of felt a closeness that we had not felt before.
For the first time in history today, man got a long-distance live view of the planet he lives on, transmitted and described by the first 3 human beings to travel to the moon. The Apollo 8 astronauts sent back those pictures this afternoon, and we'll have more, along with the full story, later in this broadcast.
I think what happened was Kennedy wanting to demonstrate to the Soviets that we were the biggest, baddest kids on the block, that our technology will kick your technology's ass anytime.
And it worked, and it was glorious. But it wasn't sustainable because it was a crisis project.
If it was actually about exploration and about the scientific frontier being pushed outward, if it were actually about that, maybe we would have had a scientist on the first mission to the moon. But no, there was no scientist on Apollo 11, nor on Apollo 12, or Apollo 13, or Apollo 14, or Apollo 15, or Apollo 16. The first scientist was on Apollo 17, and Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon.
There was not a statement made that we're going to go to the moon and establish a human community. We're not going to go to, the moon and then on to Mars. We're not going to go do this and then that. It was simply, we're going to put a human being on the moon. And we achieved it.
Do you wish that the first Apollo mission hadn't reached the moon, or that we hadn't gone on to Mars and then to the nearest star? That's like saying you wish that you still operated with scalpels and sewed your patients up with catgut, like your great-great-great-great-grandfather used to.
Ever since the time of Sputnik and President Kennedy, I think our dedication to the space program has been higher than most countries. And I feel like probably over the past decade, it's waned significantly.
I feel like we should be doing more in space because I think there's a lot of learning to be done as far as vaccines and a lot of things that can help the American people. Even though it's not a sexy program like it used to be with the moon landing, I think it's more important now than it has been in decades.
I know that it's not really doing much anymore since the space shuttle program was closed down. So I don't know what they're up to. Be cool if they were doing something soon.
When I see them building robots, to go on Mars, or I see what the rover and Curiosity and Opportunity and Spirits are doing, we basically it excites me to know that we're doing that. To me, a culture that's not doing that is stagnant, and a culture that is doing that is progressive and moving forward in a positive direction.
Back in the 60s, when we first, when the space program was in full swing, I fully expected us to have colonies on the moon by this time. Where are they? I'm disappointed to see that we're not putting more effort into something like that.
I think it's just absolutely essential that we maintain this program and advance it.
All those who think it's a problem that we haven't been outside of low Earth orbit for 4 decades can only say so because they think that going to the moon was the first step of this great adventure where we explore space, and somehow we've failed on the expectations we had for ourselves. But once you realize we went because we were at war, and then they're not going to the moon, they're not going to Mars, and the Cold War's over, what's your motivation?
The moon, a lonely world in the absence of man. But here we have left our mark, a signature attesting a legacy to future generations. We stood on the shoulders of giants and touched the moon.
The decision on what to do after Apollo was driven by a desire to limit NASA's spending to only a fraction of what it had been at the height of the Apollo program. And in order to reach that lower budget, you couldn't continue to use Saturn V's. They were too expensive per launch. So the program devolved back into a low Earth orbit program.
Senator Edward Kennedy urged today that spending on the space program be cut back after the goals set for exploring the moon have been achieved. Senator Kennedy said a substantial portion of the space budget should be diverted to what he called pressing problems here at home.
Going into outer space is very expensive. It costs $10,000 to put a pound of anything just into near-Earth orbit. That's your weight in gold. Now, to put you on the moon costs about $100,000 a pound. And to put you on Mars will cost over $1 million a pound. That is your weight in diamonds. Back in the 1960s, the great superpowers didn't care spending so much money on the space race because it was a matter of national pride and national security. But now that the Cold War is over, the great powers are not willing to spend so much of their national treasure because national pride and national security are no longer at stake.
Imagine if you and I climbed in a plane right now and wanted to fly to New York City and back. And along the way, all of its pieces are going to be thrown away. So that when you arrive in New York, if you make it at all, you'll arrive in a little capsule and land. Now, the only way you get to come back is for them to rebuild the entire rocket upon which that original capsule stood, climb in it, and fly back. And by the way, you're going to throw all the pieces away again. What that pretty well assures you is that very, very few people are going to make that trip.
If all goes according to schedule, scenes like this, a reusable space shuttle making its final approach to land, will be a common sight beginning next fall.
The space shuttle was promised to us in the 70s as a vehicle that would fly over 50 times a year. The shuttle was going to bring the cost of going into orbit down to $100 a pound.
It looks like a jet plane, will lift off like a rocket, and will return like a glider. Commuting to space every 2 weeks is the plan.
If you measure it by that metric, the program was a complete and utter failure.
The basic drivers were low-cost, reliable, reusable. Let's call it a space bus. That was the motivation in 1969. A bus, up and down under all conditions. And the shuttle program did not turn out the way it was supposed to. It was supposed to be $10 million a flight. It ended up $1.2 billion a flight. So, you know, we missed by 1,200 times over.
The shuttle's kind of all things to all people. Originally, from NASA's point of view, it was going to be a supply vehicle to go to a large space station. And NASA in 1969 proposed building a space station and having it supplied by the shuttle. The Nixon administration decided not to approve a station. And so the rationale for shuttle had to be kind of reinvented, and it became a launch vehicle for everything.
That's the theory of Dr. John Logsdon, a George Washington University political science professor who has written extensively on the space program for the last dozen years.
NASA got used to the luxury of the extra money, the public attention, the importance to the general public that came with Apollo, and the excitement and the challenge, and wanted to do it again.
What do we need a space shuttle for, or a space station? Well, some people said that we need a space station to be the terminus for the space shuttle. Well, then why do we need a space shuttle? To be the way to reach the space station. Now, I think that's a bit circular, isn't it?
You know, at first you look at the space program, oh, that's so cool, the space shuttle, that's amazing. You know, this is great. And then you really look at it and you realize, hold it, they're not going anywhere. They're not doing anything.
John Logsdon says the shuttle could turn out to be a classic mistake.
It's a pretty good space truck for taking things up and down, but for doing anything once you're in orbit, say it's a very inflexible and underpowered vehicle.
The shuttle is the most complex space vehicle man has ever built. It is a result of 9 years of compromise, negotiation, and cost overruns. Soon, we'll begin to find out if it was all worth it. John Dancy, NBC News at Kennedy Space Center.
So the shuttle was designed to be reusable and therefore much less expensive. And in the end, there was no way to maintain the flight rate that was projected for it. It just didn't work out that way because it was too complex, too expensive, and then we had the accidents.
Is the worst disaster in the history of the American space program, and President Reagan has declared a week of mourning for the 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, who lost their lives on their way into space this morning.
Yeah, the Challenger really changed everything. It was a priority in the nation to get every payload onto the shuttle, to get its usage up, to make sure its utilization was as high as it could be.
There was a lot of attention focused on it. It was a terrible tragedy, replayed over and over again on television. And there had sort of been a feeling in the space community that if there was a tragic accident with the shuttle, it would never fly again. There was 32 months, I think it was, before another space shuttle flew, but there were changes, considerable changes to the nature of the space shuttle program after that. For example, originally the shuttle was going to be launching just about every satellite that the United States wanted to put up. And instead they said that, no, you only are going to use this for things that you really need to have people involved in. If you can just launch it on a rocket, launch it on a rocket. You don't need to launch it on the space shuttle.
To take these highly skilled, amazing people called astronauts and put them in charge of driving this truck around in circles in orbit, instead of doing something really exciting and important. You know, that's where the problems came from, and that came from a lack of leadership down the street from NASA, you know, in Congress and in the White House.
The shuttle did mature us, though. It was so difficult. New sciences, new technology, so difficult to operate, it made us good. We had to be good to operate that system. Well, at the end of the shuttle program, we are a massively good spacefaring nation. We, the U.S. now, we're fantastic now. We are good now. We're excellent in the spacefaring business. The difficulty of the shuttle made us good. But after that, space station was a massive strategic error.
Skylab was the first test of our ability to endure weightlessness, and astronauts found that they could effectively work, exercise, eat, and sleep in their temporary home. More recently, the space shuttle has allowed us to fly into orbit, conduct our business, and return. In addition to providing a laboratory for carrying out experiments in microgravity, the shuttle has also benefited us commercially and scientifically through the deployment and capture of satellites. But the shuttle was designed with a larger goal in mind, to transport astronauts and materials to a proposed base, a permanent manned space station.
Space station was NASA's primary objective after Apollo. It's what NASA hoped to get approved was a 12-person space station launched by Saturn V and supplied by the shuttle in the 69-70 period. The White House did not approve that program, and instead we went ahead with the space shuttle. But the shuttle was designed to launch modules of the space station. And it was clear in 1971 or 72 that once the shuttle started flying, NASA would go back and ask approval to develop the space station. And indeed they did that in 1983, and finally President Reagan announced approval of the space station in the State of the Union address in January of '84.
Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
Despite problems with recent missions, NASA is still pushing hard for a permanent space station someday.
Many scientists and politicians say it is not clear what purpose the space station is supposed to serve.
We're doing it backwards. We're saying we're going to have a station, and by the way, what can you do if you have a station?
Yes, it costs $100 billion. Yes, it's a cooperative effort of many nations. But a lot of the space station, I think, was wasteful because the science done on the space station was actually minimal.
Skylab 73 was a massively successful space station. It already had 200 experiments built in. All those things matured us in terms of on-orbit space ops and long-term space flight. We already did that. So I'm not criticizing space station. What I am saying is, what does space station do for the man on the street? They don't know. Go out and ask them.
I honestly don't know, and they make no effort to, tell normal people. So, I don't know what's going on at all.
You know, I really don't know what they're doing. They don't really say anything. All you hear is they bring supplies back and forth. So, what is the object of it?
I have no idea what they'd be doing up there. Honestly, I don't pay that much attention to this kind of stuff.
No. Unfortunately, Not now. We don't know. Not now. Yeah. No.
If you have a program which costs $150 billion and you ask the person on the street, what are you getting for this, and they don't know, you've missed the vision, sir.
We actually didn't finish building the space station until 2010. It was supposed to be done in 1994. Well, it did, in fact, basically suck the life out of the human spaceflight program for 25 years. And so it was very hard to get approval for new things going forward. Not that people didn't try.
We must commit ourselves anew to a sustained program of manned exploration of the solar system, and yes, the permanent settlement of space.
As George H.W. Bush came into the White House, he indicated he wanted to do something to revitalize the space program. And his advisors prepared for him an announcement called the Space Exploration Initiative.
back to the moon, on to Mars, this time to stay. Great stuff, but NASA came back with a program to do it in 30 years that involved building floating spaceports and giant interplanetary spaceships and all kinds of things that were never going to happen.
And, of course, the architecture meant you'd have to have a launch system and you'd have to have all the other pieces of what it would take to do an entire mission to the surface of the moon and go on to Mars. Well, you total up all those assets necessary over a 20-year period, and the total was $500 billion. Well, that figure got leaked to the Hill, and the way the Hill looks at money is $500 billion with a B is in like today's money. And so it was dead on arrival. They never even bothered to look at it.
Let me introduce to you our speaker for this afternoon, Robert Zubrin from Martin Marietta Astro. He's senior engineer there on the Moon and Mars Initiative missions work that Martin Marietta is doing. Robert, come talk to us.
Mars Direct is a plan for sending humans to Mars with present-day technology. It's a plan that could be implemented within 8 years of program start. This was developed by myself and another engineer named David Baker while we were working at the Martin Marietta Astronautics Company circa 1990. What Baker and I did was design a plan that would allow us to do a human Mars mission in just 2 launches of a Saturn V heavy lift booster, okay, like the one we used during Apollo. And before you know it, you've created the beginning of the first human settlement on a new world. There's nothing in this that is beyond our technology. Around 1993, Mike Griffin was appointed Associate Administrator for Exploration, and he liked Mars Direct. He had us go back to Johnson Space Center and talk to them again, with this time the people at headquarters telling them that they had to listen. And they listened, and they came up with a variant of Mars Direct as their new Mars mission plan. And according to their analysis, it cut the cost of a human Mars exploration program by a factor of 8. Okay? Now, unfortunately, by then Clinton was in office, and he wasn't interested, so he told them to just shut up. Okay? But the problem is that we've never had a situation where both NASA and the administration were on board at the same time, except during Apollo.
My name is Michelle Stellhorn. I am a teacher in the Gifted Education Program of the Rockwood School District, and I teach a unit called Mission to Mars, and we cover the congressional space debate and the importance and future of space exploration.
Do you want to be an astronaut?
No, because I like Earth and I want to stay on it, but I think that space exploration is really cool.
It's too expensive. We have national debt, we have the job deficit.
Do you think that we should be spending more money and effort in space exploration?
Well, I personally think we should, but I think that since there's so many people around the world who are struggling to just put food on the table, I don't see how we can. I mean, we could, but there's so many other problems that are major focuses that the government should be studying, that should be working on. We need to get our national debt paid off before we can go and play around in space.
If given the opportunity, if somebody said, do you want to go to space, would you go?
Me, I think that depends how much they pay me.
Don't want to be an astronaut? What are they going to fly? There's nothing to fly. There is no Mars program. There is no astronaut program. There's casual talk about it. I know what a program is. I know when a man says you're going to the moon and you're coming home 8 years from now. I know what that means.
The space shuttle pulls into port for the last time. Its voyage at an end.
You know, there's a lot of people that think that the end of the shuttle program was the end of America going out into space. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. Flying a shuttle in circles around the Earth is not exploring. It's not pushing forward the human frontier. You're simply making work. You're simply funneling taxpayer money into certain people's pockets who are working in different areas, politicians, aerospace companies, people who run space centers. That's not what this should be about. But that's what it's become because there's no leadership, because there's no vision.
In Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages and we did not copy your last. Columbia, Houston, comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
February 1st, 2003, Columbia re-enters tragically and breaks up over Texas. The notion that we could continue flying the shuttle for a long time went away.
The commission that investigated that accident said, if you're going to be risking human lives, you really need to explain what it is that you're trying to accomplish in human spaceflight.
Consistent with safety concerns and the recommendations of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. The shuttle's chief purpose over the next several years will be to help finish assembly of the International Space Station. In 2010, the Space Shuttle, after nearly 30 years of duty, will be retired from service.
The first shuttle tragedy made everybody stop and think exactly what it was we were using the shuttle for, and did you really need to have humans aboard in a spacecraft in order to launch satellites? And the second tragedy, Columbia, really brought it down to a real focus on, well, why are you doing human spaceflight at all?
Using the crew exploration vehicle, we will undertake extended human missions to the moon as early as 2015, with the goal of living and working there for increasingly extended periods of time.
See, I was there. I was literally in the room when President Bush announced we were going to go back to the moon and on to Mars. And I'm a Texan. I was close enough to where I could look at him, and we're fairly good at spotting BS in each other. And I think he really meant it.
President Bush, to his credit, said, we're not going to just do this anymore. We're going to do something different. And we should go back and we should explore.
A powerful argument was made that what needed to happen was we needed to start making economic use of all of the things that we had found by all this taxpayer-funded space exploration. If we want to start going back to the moon, but this time for economically useful purposes, how would we do that? And they came up with some really interesting ideas, all of which were affordable, all of which were executable, all of which were quite reasonable paths that we could have gone forward, none of which looked like Apollo.
And then he hired a new NASA administrator who said he was absolutely dedicated to carrying out the president's vision. And that was Dr. Michael Griffin. And Griffin came in and said, I know how I'm going to do this. And he had a plan. He had a way of getting America back to the moon and then on to Mars.
It is very Apollo-like. It may have a different shaped heat shield. It may have a different surface contact system. But the outer mold line is very Apollo-like, except larger. Think of it as Apollo on steroids.
Everything was tanked. All of the ideas were dropped and ditched because Mike Griffin had his own plan for Das Program.
NASA's new program for human space exploration is called Constellation. For the first time in a generation, we will be traveling beyond low Earth orbit, returning to the moon, and expanding human presence to Mars. Exploration must be taken in steps. Because we learn from every journey, there is a link between every place we go.
very quickly, the Bush administration started to cut back on some of NASA's hoped-for budget increases. That brought you to the Obama administration, in which they said,
I understand that some believe that we should attempt a return to the surface of the moon first, as previously planned. But I just have to say, pretty bluntly here, we've been there before.
Will American astronauts return to the moon in the foreseeable future? NBC News has learned that plans to travel there and beyond may in fact be scrubbed.
The White House was willing to support the vision of returning to the moon by 2020 and going on to Mars verbally, but not when it came down to the nation's pocketbook.
It had been known from the start that Constellation could not be executed on anything like NASA's current budget. The assumption was made that NASA would receive a very substantial budget increase in order to do something like Constellation.
When President Obama came into office, he set up this committee to take a look at the Constellation program, and that committee determined that technically the Constellation program was doing quite well, but that there wasn't enough money.
The budget for that program had been reduced substantially every single year since it started. And as a result, our look at the Constellation program that we were then pursuing was that it was not executable. The program was on a trajectory to fail.
We did recommend that either NASA's budget be increased rather substantially, or that they should be given some other mission that they can do within their current budget.
Everyone agrees that there's a $3 billion shortfall in what we need to accomplish our goals. Of what you have suggested as alternatives, other options, are any of those accomplishable without that shortfall?
Do you want to deal with that?
No. Okay, there you go.
The White House was not willing to invest that kind of money in it. Congress was not willing to invest that kind of money in it. So the Constellation program was canceled.
The reason we were unable to sustain humanity in space or on the moon after Apollo was there was no decision to do so. And there was no technology that was designed to allow us to do so because the decision was not there. Interestingly, in the Constellation program and under President Bush, he said we're going to establish human permanence beyond the Earth. Unfortunately, the people in charge were unable to understand what that meant and instead redesigned a bigger, badder version of the Apollo program. It was doomed to failure from the beginning.
September of 2011, NASA proposes a new capability for human exploration, a massive rocket, the largest ever built, for a variety of missions beyond low Earth orbit.
When President Obama announced that he was canceling Constellation, what he wanted to do was to wait 5 years and invest in game-changing technologies. And after that period of time, a decision would be made as to what new rockets or spacecraft were needed to go wherever it is the nation was going to go next in human spaceflight.
And that presupposed in 5 years you can do something that essentially obsoletes chemical propulsion.
We will increase investment right away in other groundbreaking technologies that will allow astronauts to reach space sooner and more often.
Well, there was nothing in the pipeline at all that would do that. I mean, there was discussion of what might be, there was some hypotheses of what could be done, but now we're 5 years later, and there really was nothing in the pipeline that was even remotely mature enough.
And Congress hated that idea. Congress felt it was really important to have a destination and a time frame within which to meet specific visionary goals for human spaceflight. And so Congress wrote into law directing NASA to build a new big rocket, which they called the Space Launch System, and to build a multi-purpose crew vehicle, which we know as Orion, in order to provide the capabilities to keep a vigorous human spaceflight program going.
So Constellation was canceled, but Congress promptly reinstated all the expensive parts of it under new names, but did not give NASA the budget increase that would be necessary to fly missions with them.
Do you know what the budget for the SLS launch system is? We don't know, so you don't know either, quite frankly. That was a leading question.
All right.
And if that money was going to be taken out of your budget to develop the SLS launch system, rather than go with the launch systems that we've already got, would you be supportive of that?
No.
Right.
We really don't have a lot of momentum and a lot of vision on what Space Launch System's going to do. It's been pegged the rocket to nowhere.
When they finally get it upgraded to the 130 metric tons, which may be 2025, it will be equivalent and almost equal to a Saturn V, which we will have had 60 years earlier. We're talking about after proving one flight that we might do an orbit around the moon, called Apollo 8. You're keeping space station alive, you're supporting the various NASA centers, you got 2 pieces of hardware you're developing, but they have no destination, and they're like what we did 60 years ago.
I always call it a rocket to anywhere, because it's just like the shuttle. When the shuttle was designed, it was designed to be a shuttle capability. It didn't have payloads identified. All those missions were non-existent on the day the first shuttle flew.
If space is a frontier, and I shall hereby declare it to be so, and your goal is to settle the frontier, in other words, for people to live there, like they do here in what used to be a frontier, then you have to create a means for that to occur. No frontier has ever been opened based on the development and operation of a single giant government vehicle.
They can launch 2 to 3, at least 2, and potentially 3 SLSs per year. They can build that many and they can launch that many. That's the way the design of the infrastructure and the vehicle and the assembly plant is set up to do. But they need more funding.
To date, unfortunately, the budget has not been increased, and that's a major concern. It's been a major concern since day one. And if there's anything our commission emphasized, it was that we have to have a budget and a space program that are consistent with each other. And unfortunately, throughout the human spaceflight history for a couple of decades, that's not been the case.
Tonight, NASA announced further cuts have been ordered in its new budget, and one effect will be a delay in the timetable for the space shuttle.
50,000 employees are not looking forward, they're looking elsewhere.
If this country really needs another expensive piece of hardware in orbit, when here on the ground we can hardly get the mail delivered.
Congress cut the shuttle's budget by $234 million.
Already there have been some cutbacks, and there could be others.
It is without question the biggest waste of money I've seen since I've been in the United States Senate.
Today, President Clinton put in his latest bid. He outlined $13 billion in savings at 4 federal agencies, more than half the cuts at NASA.
The bailout, the bank bailout, that sum of money is greater than the entire 50-year running budget of NASA.
Wow.
I think we have to be realistic when it comes to the budget. If we need additional funds for a heavy lift rocket, we're going to have to set priorities and have to shift funds from other parts of the program. I don't think that NASA or our space program is somehow going to defy budget gravity and be the only agency to get an increase when every other agency is either going to be flatlined or be subject to the budgetary constraints. So I think we're just going to have to be smarter. We're going to have to make sure we don't have cost overruns, and we're going to have to set priorities and use the money that we do have better, and then we can get the funds, say, for a heavy lift rocket.
If we started today, how long do each of you estimate it would be before we could place a person on Mars?
With the current budget?
Yes. Give me a date with the current budget and a date with the Apollo era budget.
With the current budget, bear with me, I would probably say never.
Hey, China, can we borrow some money to finish our Mars trip?
you know, with Constellation, Mike Griffin, and now people with the SLS just assume that if we develop the SLS, it will fly forever. We had the Saturn V. It worked. It was flying humans to the moon. And we canceled it.
When did we last leave low Earth orbit? You know, a couple of hundred miles up where the space station, space shuttle orbit. To go somewhere interesting with humans. When did we last do it? 1972, Apollo 17. It's been more than 4 decades since we've left Earth for another destination. What's the problem? What are we missing? Is it political will? Is it motivation? Is it money? Are we distracted? Are there other issues? We went to the moon in the 1960s. What, we didn't have problems in the 1960s? We were at a hot war in Southeast Asia, a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The civil rights movement was fully underway. There was campus unrest. There were riots in the urban centers.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
We had the greatest problems the country has seen since the Civil War. And in that climate, on that landscape, we went to the moon. So don't turn around and tell me that these past 4 decades we've had challenges we couldn't overcome. That's why we're not going into space. No, that's not the reason we're not going into space.
It is the most natural question in the world to say, you know, if you're a young person in this country, wait a second, we were on the moon? American citizens were walking around, jumping around on the moon? They were driving a golf cart on the moon? They brought back hundreds of pounds of specially selected rock samples to see what the geological history of the moon was? And you stopped? Why did you stop? Are you people nuts?
My read of history tells me there's only 2, maybe 3 motivations for ever doing something so grand. And one of them is war. The other is money. Let's do it for money. If you can do it for money, it'll happen. I've never seen anyone do it to explore.
There is a growing tendency to think of man as a rational thinking being, which is absurd. There is simply no evidence of any intelligence on the Earth. Wait.
Why do we stop producing Saturn V rockets? It's one of the great mysteries to me. The Saturn V rocket can put more mass into low Earth orbit than our shuttle. It had been a natural to help build the International Space Station.
The Saturn V was a really unique rocket in the sense that it was really the first rocket designed for exploration. The Mercury projects launched on a Redstone, which was an intermediate-range ballistic missile that was modified. Then the Gemini went up on a Titan, which was an ICBM. So the Saturn program was really the first rocket that was never designed to be launching missiles on other people. It was actually the first one that was designed to launch people to new destinations. So the Saturn V was a leap beyond anything that had been seen before. It had 5.5 million pound thrust engines on just the first stage. The second stage had 5.25 million pound thrust hydrogen engines on it, and had a third stage with another 250 million pound thrust. It was a massive rocket. It was something that had never been done before, and it worked very well. And it was able to do things that nothing could have been able to do, and nothing can do today.
We have a tendency in this country, like the tortoise and the hare. We are the hare. We build something, we do something, we go back and try something else.
Look, folks, modern design! Woohoo!
The Russians, in the meanwhile, are the tortoise. They build something, they keep it going. Do you know that the booster, the rocket that put Eureka Garin up in space in 1961, is basically the same vehicle that's putting our astronauts and their cosmonauts into the International Space Station today? The same vehicle. And yet, we don't keep ours. The Saturn V could have been improved. That would have been a good stepping stone towards going back to the moon. We could have improved the lunar module. We could have done lots of things to the Saturn V to upgrade it, and we'd have had it still a viable lunar program going. It's a tragedy, and I will mention that every time that someone tells me. It's a tragedy that we stopped building the Saturn V rocket.
The decision to stop production of the Saturn V dates back really to the Lyndon Johnson administration.
The space agency, facing severe budget restrictions, has decided to cut back Apollo moon landing missions to 2 flights a year.
NASA stopped ordering long lead time items for the Saturn V in 1968 and announced suspension of its production. There were 15 built, and then there weren't going to be any more. Then there were ambitious recommendations to Nixon in September of '69 to use Mars as the long-term goal of the program and build a space station. Those recommendations were rejected in the fall of '69, and then there was no need for the kind of capability represented by the Saturn V. So it was in the budget cycle in December of 1969 that the decision finally was made to suspend production, basically shut the program down.
We had a president who was not particularly interested in the space program. We had a Vietnam War that was picking up a lot of money. And so as soon as the NASA budget for Apollo began to drop off a little, the White House looked at it like a great place to get money.
Thomas Paine, administrator of the space agency, said today that 50,000 people will be dropped and the space program stretched out as a result of what he called fairly stringent budget cuts ordered by President Nixon. Most of those who will lose their jobs work for private contractors, the rest for the space agency. Among other things, Paine said production of the Saturn V rocket will be ended. The last one will be used to launch an experimental space station. The rocket was designed at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama.
Now take space. There's the whole space thing. I personally think we've gone, as far as the moon thing, we've probably overdone that one. We could start with probably about 5 Apollos more. We can do something else in space. You've got to get a way to get off those damn moonshots. If you ever get raising that point, there can't be any after July. And the one that seems to me to have the least appeal are any more Apollo shots, frankly. What in the hell do they have to go up there and take a look at that damn thing again?
The idea of going to Mars was not selling. Putting a base on the moon was not selling. We weren't going to get the big space station. We knew we weren't going to get the nuclear rocket. With the Apollo program doing so well, we thought we would be able to at least continue with the sort of budget support that we had had for Apollo, which had been terrific, and didn't happen. And so we were a pretty depressed group for a while. Saturn V, Saturn 1B, command module, it all disappeared. And there'll be a mission to Mars someday, but I don't know when. 50 years from now, maybe.
This time, vote like your whole world depended on it.
When I look at the present direction of our space program today, I feel disappointed. I feel that our leaders don't really have a good reason for continuing it. I think that that it's not their desire to really have a first-class, first-rate program that they can be proud of. And we look at ways that we waste money in this country when we could put it to good use in a program that everybody really, the average individual, really wants to see done, then it kind of makes me feel sad.
You know, today we stand on the shoulders of giants. And we have to honor those people. I know a lot of Apollo astronauts. They're pretty pissed off because they did their job. They did what they were asked to do. They put their lives on the line. They went out and they did something incredible. And then nothing happened.
Can NASA mount a project? Can they do a project anymore? Or does the project become so politicized and so wrapped up in Washington that it gets strangulated and can't happen? Unfortunately, I come from the 60s. I'm not cynical. I come from the 60s. The greatest project management the world has ever seen on any project, and we did it. We did it urgently. We did it on cost, on schedule, and we did it right. Even with 45 years of hindsight history, we did it right.
I believed that when we landed on the moon in 1969 as a flight director, my children would see an American back on the moon. I'm starting to lose that belief. I had hoped that I would see it myself. That is now impossible.
Ironically, going to the moon could have been a natural continuation of the westward migration that began with the 13 colonies and continued to the end of the 1800s. But we didn't do it that way. We had a government-planned crisis project instead of opening up space like a frontier.
You realize during the entire golden age of space exploration that we generally associate with the 1960s and the voyage to the moon, we remember ourselves as pioneers in that era, but in fact, we were reactive to the statements made by the Soviets, rather than proactive in fulfillment of dreams we had. They put up a satellite, we got to put up a satellite. They put an animal, non-human animal in orbit, we put a non-human animal. They put up a first human, we put up a first human. This went on and on and on, with Russia beating us in practically everything. Then we get to the moon before they did, we say, we win. If that's how we look at it, we didn't understand who was pioneering that race. So we are better at reacting than proacting. Given that fact, we may have to sink deeper into economic poverty as a nation before we wake up and say, we got to do something about this. It's an unfortunate fact of how we function.
You know, there's a generation out there right now that doesn't believe we've ever been to the moon. Now, that's not because the shadows from the flag fall the wrong way, or the lens flare is wrong, or you can't see the stars because of the contrast ratio, or this or that or the other, or anything like that. The real reason that any of that sticks at all is that we're not there now. And it's incredibly hard to believe that if we ever did something that magnificent, that exciting, that inspirational, why did we stop? That's the reason there's people who believe we never went. Why aren't we there now?
Peacetime, Jim. The government isn't making that kind of appropriations. Well, they'll need the rocket one of these days, and if it's not ready, the government will do the job. And they'll turn to you, to private industry, to do it. Government always does that when it gets in a jam. It has to. This time, I figured we might be ready for the government.
The British government explored Hudson Bay. Then the Hudson Bay Company was created. The U.S. government explores the moon, then the GoFindLunarRocks.com company will get created.
We have companies now, SpaceX leading the way, bringing cargo to and from the space station. That should have been happening decades ago. You don't need astronauts to serve as truck drivers, hauling cargo back and forth. An unmanned vehicle can do that, and let the commercial marketplace take care of it. Let them bid for that. They can do it faster, cheaper, better than any government program could do it, for sure.
When airplanes were first beginning, a very smart group of people decided that America was not going to own its own fleet, its own airline. It said what we're going to do is help build the airline industry and the airplane industry. And they did that by simply guaranteeing a certain amount of mail that was going to be traveling on airplanes. And what happened was that an industry developed where America became the leading country and the leading technology developer of what we now know as modern aviation.
People should be able to come up with creative, beneficial things that they can figure out how to afford to do. And if there's science involved that can benefit the country, then the federal government can get involved. If there's technology that needs to be developed that can help people, the government can get involved there. And we can have partnerships and we can move out. You know, we can have the 21st century equivalent of the Transcontinental Railroad, which, by the way, was built by private companies without a government Department of Railroads telling them how to do it. We did it with land grants. Well, we could do the same thing in space. We can do the same sort of innovative partnerships in space. We just have to get away from this sort of bureaucratic mindset that it needs to be a government program to do it for us.
The vast amount of brains, talents, special skills, and research facilities necessary for this project are not in the government. Nor can they be mobilized by the government in peacetime without fatal delay. Only American industry can do this job.
The way frontiers have been opened and the way that they should be opened is by an interaction of the private and the public sector, working for the good of all, so that the government is providing a Lewis and Clark function, a Magellan function, a Drake function. And then those explorers are returning and telling us about what's over the hill, what's across that ocean. And then the private sector moves into that realm and begins to turn what it is that's been found into new lands, new wealth. And that's how you open a frontier. You don't open a frontier by sending a few highly paid government employees out there in a large and expensive government vehicle and throwing most of it away on the way there and back.
Well, I know one thing. If they do build a space station in my lifetime or send a ship to the moon, I'm going to be ready to go.
What courses are you taking next year?
Oh, my schedule's already made out. In the 9th grade, you have to take mathematics and English and history.
No science?
Well, I had my choice of taking general science this year or next, but I put it off a year.
Then you put your trip off a year.
Science is the engine of prosperity. All the wealth we see around us comes from science. But science is made by scientists, mainly young people. Young people have to be inspired. They have to look into the sky and say, wow, I want to be part of this great endeavor to explore the universe.
The real spin-off that matters out of the Apollo program was a generation that saw that. And in their mind, they mixed, here's the Apollo program and people really doing something cool out there in space. And here's Captain Kirk and these kinds of shows and movies, 2001 Space Odyssey. And if you put this all together in the mind of a child or a teenager, what begins to happen is a synthesis that says, I want to do that. Somebody's done it. I can do it. I'm going to figure out how to do it. The biggest spin-off of the Apollo program was a generation who stayed in school, who studied, and now they want to do that. They want to give back to civilization in the way that they were inspired to do as children.
My son looked up at me one night and asked me, sorry, it still breaks me up, Daddy, is it really true that they used to fly to the moon when you were a boy?
I was really disappointed that we had not sent anyone to Mars, that we had not progressed beyond Apollo. And I kept waiting for when we would, and it just didn't happen year after year.
I submit that if we engage in another bold vision like we did in the 60s, this time not motivated by war, but by an understanding of the impact of that adventure on our culture. Our culture. What people wanted to be when they grew up.
I am a child of Apollo. The greatest influences I had growing up were NASA and Star Trek. I didn't just believe we were going into space, I expected it.
It stimulates an entire generation of scientists and technologists. And this is the 21st century. You need them if you care about the health of your economy tomorrow. You need folks like that around you.
I went to the NASA website to just see when are we going to Mars, and I couldn't find that out. So then I thought, well, perhaps this is a question of will. Is there sufficient will to do this?
The reason I fight so hard for this cause is because I believe we are here to expand and grow and carry the light of life into space.
If we don't embrace space as a frontier, what are we? As a species, we have the power to do it. We have the know-how to do it. We know what it can bring us, culturally, economically, militaristically. To not do it is to simply not have the foresight.
In these final hours before Apollo 17, some people are gloomy about the future of space exploration. Not among them is Dr. Wernher von Braun, the retired rocket expert who developed the big Saturn launch vehicles used to send men on their way to the moon. I talked with Dr. von Braun earlier this evening.
I think all good things have an ending. And I consider Apollo a little bit, as it were, as the sailing ship and dog sled area to the South Pole. Well, next time we'll go to the South Pole, we'll go by turboprop airplane.
We doubled the number of science graduates in this country during Apollo, at every level, high school, college, PhD.
What force was operating to make everyone want to become scientists? We were going to the moon. So our motivation was militaristically driven, but we benefited economically from it because scientists and technologists invent the economies of tomorrow. We used to invent new things with such frequency that you didn't fix something that was about to break, you put in something completely new that took you to a new place. You didn't have to worry about the old thing breaking because you just replaced the entire structure with better materials, lighter materials, more durable materials. These are the things that come out of an innovation nation. You know how you get an innovation nation? You put a bold project in front of them that inspires people to want to innovate in the first place. And I know of no greater force of nature than what going into space can do for the next generation of people who are tasked with taking us into the 21st century.
I believe that we can carry this battle and basically address it, articulate it as an economic challenge to the nation, a technological challenge to the nation, a spiritual challenge to the nation, that we have to believe as a nation we are capable of doing difficult things and move forward and do it.
We need to bring America's character to bear on America's frontier. And if we do that, there is no limit to what we can accomplish.
We were given the Apollo program because of a set of challenges that a very young president faced. We were fortunate at that time we had the articulators. We had the von Brauns and the Lows and the Gurus who were capable of going out and basically talking to this president and talking to the U.S. Congress and selling this program. We need the people who have that fluency, that belief, and are willing to expend themselves in that cause.
During the Apollo era, you didn't need government programs trying to convince people that doing science and engineering was good for the country. It was self-evident. Maybe we need a department of future thinkers who aren't thinking, will I get reelected this November? Who aren't thinking, can we afford this now? I have these other problems I have to solve. No, we need like a new presidential cabinet position, the futurist. They can help set priorities for how we invest versus the return on that investment later on. That's what we need. We don't have that. And I've been trying, but I've been failing. So I gave up. Just going back to my lab. I'm tired of screaming into people's ears.
What we got paid back for were millions of scientists, engineers, doctors, medical researchers, inventors, okay? Who are the people who created the economic boom of the 1990s, these 40-year-old techno-billionaires who built Silicon Valley? These are the 12-year-olds of the 1960s. Apollo worked because John F. Kennedy said in 1961, we are going to be on the moon by the end of the decade. And while administrations changed in early 1969, we were practically to the moon, and they weren't about to cancel that at that point. If instead Kennedy had said, I think it'd be a good idea to go to the moon and we should do it by the year 2000, we never would have made it to the moon.
It's not about the rocket equation. It's not about physics. We solve those issues every single day. We have built a cage around our ideas. We have built a cage around our future that says you cannot. We are telling the generation that exists today that they're going to have less, that they should give up their dreams, that their job is to save a planet that we've screwed up.
What really matters is that someday there's a kid living on the moon, there's a kid living in free space, there's a kid living on Mars who looks back at the Earth and says, that's where we came from, turns their head, looks the other way and says, that's where we're going.
It will be a human endeavor. It will bring out the best in humankind. Space exploration has changed your life, and it's made your life better. The food you eat, your communication systems, your transportation systems are all made better by space. But deeper and bigger and more importantly, your view of your relationship to the cosmos, your place in space, is fundamentally influenced by people who have insisted that we explore space, that we go over the horizon, that we look beyond what we can see. And that is all to the good. And it is in everyone's best interest to support it.
We cannot allow ourselves to settle for the condition and the state that we are in today. We have to become the foot soldiers in the fight for space, and it has to apply to every person who lives, works, and dreams of space, and it's time to do it now. I got fired.
Really?
Yes, sir. Out the door. We're not going to fly you again. We don't have a job for you. They get tired of hearing this stuff. And when you're jabbing them, the bureaucrats, you're jabbing them, they've had enough.